This is part 4 of 5 in our discussion on the sacrament of holy orders. Last week we finished up talking about how the sacrament of holy orders is an efficacious sign of God's grace instituted by Jesus Christ. And today we'll be talking about how holy orders is the fourth part of the definition of the sacrament, entrusted to the church. So let's take a look at the very early church and see what was going on. St. Ignatius of Antioch was one of the earliest church fathers who died in the year 108 AD. He personally knew John, one of the 12 apostles. So if you want an early snapshot of the church, you can't do that much better than him. This is from some of the earliest Christian writings outside of the Bible that we know of. St. Ignatius said this about the sacrament of holy orders. He said, "Without the bishop, presbyters, and deacons, one cannot speak of the church." And so this is where we get the term, quote, holy orders. These are the three orders of clergy outlined by St. Ignatius: bishops, presbyters, which is just the Greek word for priest, and deacons. And we're going to address each of these orders in detail. First, bishops. The bishop receives the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders, meaning that he can administer any sacrament, that it makes him the head of a particular church entrusted to him. Bishops are thought of as the successors of the apostles. They follow in the footsteps of the apostles, and they operate under the authority of the successor of Peter, who is the first pope. There's different types of bishops, of course. You have the Pope himself, who is simply a bishop. He is the Bishop of Rome, and he also serves as the successor of Peter, who was sort of the centerpiece of the apostles. He is the visible head of the church. And I talked about the Pope pretty extensively just before Pope Leo was elected in May. So if you want to learn more about the popes, just listen to that homily again. A couple of interesting details that I didn't cover back then have to do with the reason why the Pope wears white as opposed to every other priest who wears black. And it all goes back to Pope St. Pius V. Pius V was a Dominican priest, and we're going to talk about this more next week when we talk about religious orders, but Dominicans wear all white, and that is the color of their habit, their outfit. And St. Pius V was such a great pope that every pope since him has worn white in honor of St. Pius V for the last 500 years or so. The next type of bishop is a cardinal. We heard a lot about these, once again, around the time of the election of Pope Leo. A cardinal can be a bishop of a large or a historically significant diocese, but a cardinal can also serve he can serve in an administrative role within the church, particularly in Rome. The main difference between cardinals and any other bishop is that the cardinals are in charge of electing the new pope when the time comes. And that's because the cardinals are technically considered to be, quote, the clergy of Rome. Each of them is the titular priest of an ancient church in the city of Rome that might not even exist anymore, but they're appointed to that when they're named a cardinal. Even though they might serve, all over the world. They are technically the clergy of Rome. Originally, all the cardinals lived in Rome, though, and they voted for their own bishop, and the cardinals wore red, like the bird cardinal. The bird is actually named after the bishop, not the other way around. Cardinals wear red because that was the color worn by the Roman senators in ancient Rome, pre-Christianity. And once Rome converted to Christianity, the clergy of Rome, the cardinals, took on the role of the senators within the Roman Empire, and they kept wearing the red. An archbishop is a bishop of a large or historically significant diocese that doesn't vote for the Pope, but is sort of a leader in a particular region. For example, Omaha is the archdiocese of our sort of region. Cardinals can be and often are archbishops as well, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, for example. And then there's regular bishops. A bishop is simply the head priest of a diocese who has authority and autonomy. The bishop is not getting daily instructions from the archbishop or from the pope. They have all the authority to enact whatever happens in their diocese. But they also work with other bishops, including the local archbishop, and bishops and archbishops they can wear purple, which is a sort of a regal color, a kingly color. So that's bishops. The next order of holy orders are the order of presbyters, or priests. Priests are united with the bishops, and they're called to be the bishop's obedient co-workers. We take that vow of obedience to our superior. The bishop assigns priests to be in charge of a parish community or another sort of administrative or pastoral role within the diocese. A priest doesn't have sacramental powers on his own. The priest can only enact the sacraments if he's delegated to do so by the bishop that ordains him or by his superior. And since the bishop, can't be present in each of the parishes that are under his control, under his care, he tasks his priests with basically filling that role. We represent the bishop in this local area. He ordains us for that reason. So in essence, I'm an extension of the bishop's agenda and authority in these 895 square miles that make up St. John and St. Germanus parishes. But at the same time, much like the bishop isn't getting daily instructions from the Pope, I'm not getting daily instructions from the bishop. So he trusts us to do the job correctly. You may have heard of a type of priest called a Monsignor. This is an honorary title given by the Pope himself to a priest that has been of great service to the church. During his entire 12-year papacy, Pope Francis only appointed a few Monsignors in the entire world. So he wasn't that high on giving priests titles, but we'll see how Pope Leo approaches it. But Monsignors, like I said, it's an honorary title. They don't have any more authority or less authority than any other priests. Monsignors, they might wear fuchsia piping on their black cassock and fuchsia sash around their waist if they wear the cassock, but that's kind of the only way you can tell the difference. Another type of priest is one that we would call a pastor. And a pastor is a confusing title to a lot of people because I think most people associate the word pastor with non-Catholic denominations. And you simply call the leader of a Protestant or an evangelical church a pastor. But within the Catholic Church, the word pastor means something pretty specific. A pastor is assigned by the bishop to lead a parish. But not all priests are pastors because they're not all leaders of a parish. So not all priests are pastors, but all pastors are priests. If a priest has the title assistant pastor or parochial vicar, they mean the same thing. It means that they assist the pastor in carrying out the bishop's work. I don't even know if I had the ability to sign checks when I was an assistant pastor. So we just do what the pastor tells us. But only bigger parishes get assistant pastors. I would say that St. Pat's in McCook is probably the smallest parish in our diocese that has an assistant, just off the top of my head. I was, usually when you're an assistant, you're training to be a pastor someday. So I was an assistant pastor for 6 years before I was made a real pastor. You can also have what's called a priest in residence. A priest in residence, they'll live in a parish, but they'll be assigned a job that isn't necessarily tied to that parish. It's just that they need to live somewhere, so we stick them somewhere. For example, the one that you guys are probably most familiar with in this area is Father Lorenz. He substitutes here a lot, but Father Lorenz lives at St. Patrick Church in McCook, but he's not assigned there. That's not his assignment. His assignment is, he has basically two assignments. One is to be a substitute in the western parts of the diocese and to do Hispanic ministry west of Holdridge. So Even though he lives in McCook, he works all over the area with the Spanish population. You may have heard of a type of priest called a dean. A dean is just another administrative title. Deans correspond with the bishop so that he's not getting correspondence from every single priest in this diocese. A dean represents a deanery, which is a section of a diocese. For example, we're in the Indianola deanery, which includes the parishes that are in McCook, Hayes Center, Indianola, Wellfleet, Curtis Farnham, North Platte, Cambridge, and Arapahoe. And there's annual reports. It's all very exciting, I promise. But it's just an administrative role. Deans don't have any more or less authority than any other priest. They are basically just the bishop's snitch. So we have to report back to him. The final details about priests have to do with how we dress. Priests wear black to symbolize death. It reminds ourselves and everybody else that we laid down our life at our ordination to serve others and to serve the church. And then the white collar represents our vow of celibacy. The final order of holy orders are the deacons. Deacons are ministers who are ordained for tasks of service in the church. They assist the priests by doing such things as preaching. They can preach homilies. They can minister to the poor and to the sick. They can baptize. They can do marriages and funerals as long as it's separate from the mass. They do share in the sacrament of holy orders, but they're not priests. And so because of this, they can't offer the mass, they can't hear confessions, they can't anoint the sick. And there's two types of deacons. First, you have transitional deacons, which, exactly as it sounds, they will be transitioning to be a priest, usually within a year's time after their ordination as a deacon. And transitional deacons take a vow of celibacy, as opposed to permanent deacons, which is exactly how it sounds. Once you're ordained a permanent deacon, you are a deacon for the remainder of the foreseeable future. Permanent deacons they're usually older men who are already married, and they feel called to serve the church in a special way. Permanent deacons can only marry prior to their ordination, and they cannot remarry in case of the death of a spouse. In our diocese, the Diocese of Lincoln, we have very few permanent deacons. I think maybe like 2 or 3. And the permanent deacons that we have are basically hand-chosen by the bishop. It's not like you can just decide to become a permanent deacon and take the required classes. You have to be chosen by the bishop, essentially. Usually, other much larger dioceses will have a high number of permanent deacons. So, for example, when I was going to school in Philadelphia, each parish in Philadelphia had 2 or 3 or 4 permanent deacons that worked there. And they helped out with baptisms and preaching and administrative roles within the parish. A lot of times the finance manager or something would be a deacon in the church. But they can't be made the pastor of a church, only a priest can. And the reason that we have so few permanent deacons in the Diocese of Lincoln is because we've been blessed over the history of our diocese to have an adequate number of priests to fill all the positions. And plus, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, our little parishes here out on the high plains of the Midwest, we can't afford to pay a salary commensurate with a married man, right? A family man. And so for that reason, permanent deacons often have careers completely outside of the church. So those are the 3 major orders within the church today. But this isn't how it always was. Through history, there were more embellishments and flourishes added to the liturgy and to the seminary and to the number of orders within the sacrament of holy orders. The medieval traditions of the church gave us 7 orders within holy orders. And within those 7, 3 of them were referred to as major orders. And the highest major order was the priest, which at that time included priests and bishops. The second of the major orders was deacon, and the third one was called a subdeacon. And a seminarian, you'd receive these orders basically at the end of each of your final years in the seminary, leading up to your priestly ordination. I'm not really sure what a subdeacon does. From what I can tell, mostly it just has to do with what their role is in the Mass. So they assist the deacon, who assists the priest, and usually they're in charge of preparing, the sacred vessels on the altar. Before the liturgical reforms of the 20th century, there were also 4 minor orders, in addition to the 3 major orders of priest, deacon, and subdeacon. And these are basically seen as milestones as you made your way through the minor seminary, and they were in many ways based on the medieval traditions of the great monasteries of Europe. The first sort of step in the seminary, as part of the initiation into the monastic life, into the monastery, the brothers would have the tops of their heads shaved off, and that's why when you see a picture of St. Anthony or St. Francis of Assisi, it's not because they had a really bad case of male pattern baldness. It's because they purposely shaved their heads out of humility, basically taking on the look of a buffoon. And this initial tradition of shaving the top of the head was called tonsure. And this tradition was carried on for centuries and even into the seminary. As part of the initiation, tonsure, while it wasn't one of the minor orders, became part of entrance into the seminary. But in more recent time, they didn't shave the entire top of your head. They snipped a lock of your hair off with the scissors. But the first of the actual minor orders, though, is called porter. In medieval times, the porter was in charge of answering the door of the monastery and admitting in those who had been baptized into the Mass. Only the baptized were allowed to attend Mass. And in the seminary, receiving the order of porter was the very first step toward the priesthood, after basically your first year in the seminary. The second minor order was called lector, and within the monastery context, the lector was the one who was in charge of catechizing or educating those who had been baptized but still had not learned their faith. And so in the seminary, this was the second step toward the priesthood, usually at the end of your second school year. The third minor order is called the exorcist, which isn't somebody who deals with, full-blown cases of exorcism or, demonic possession, but rather someone who was in charge of praying for the continued conversion of the newly baptized and the newly catechized. In the seminary, the exorcist was the third step toward the priesthood. And the final minor order was acolyte, which was a major step because acolytes were directly involved in liturgy of the Mass. They assisted the subdeacon, who assisted the deacon, who assisted the priest, by handling the water and the wine cruets. That's the acolyte's job. Now, post-Second Vatican Council, in the 1960s and 70s, the orders of subdeacon, porter, and exorcist were what are called abrogated or suppressed or repealed. And the idea was to return the church back to its original structure that St. Ignatius of Antioch talks about in his writings when he said, "Without the bishop, presbyters, and deacons, one cannot speak of the church." So after Vatican II, the church returned to that structure of bishop, priest, and deacon. Obviously, these things can change, but it's still part of the same sacrament. And the remaining minor orders, so the only two that were left, were lector and acolyte, and they were sort of recategorized as ministries. And by doing this, the lector and the acolyte were no longer exclusively tied to the monasteries or to the seminaries. It was open to more people. And so lector and acolyte were no longer connected to the sacrament of holy orders. And that made it possible for the laity, both men and women, to take part in the ministries of lector and acolyte. And that's how we can have women read at Mass, and we can bring communion, and women can also bring communion to the sick and to the homebound. So those are the orders of the sacrament of holy orders. Next week, we'll finish up the topic of holy orders by discussing some things that are not directly connected to the sacrament, but they are related to it, and so we ought to talk about them.